Analysts say
Pentagon officials tell us,
according to U.S. intelligence,
often we're encouraged to believe that officials are the ones who make news.
U.S. officials say that U.S. officials here say, these officials here at the White House tell us.
They are the ones who should be consulted to understand the situation.
I just pulled these two things out. I've laundered them so you can't really tell what I'm talking about because I don't want the Iraqis to know what I'm talking about. But trust me, trust me.
If history's any guide, the opposite is the case, that officials blow smoke and cloud reality rather than clarify.
We will, in fact, be greeted as liberators.
The notion that it will take several 100,000 U.S. troops to provide stability in post-Saddam Iraq are wildly off the mark.
So the money's going to come from Iraqi oil revenue, as everyone has said. They think it's going to be something like $2 billion this year. They think it might be something like 15, 12 next year.
A country that can really finance its own reconstruction and relatively soon.
National Security Advisors Ken Edelman and Richard Pearl, early advocates of the war, said the war would be a cakewalk.
The sources that have deceived us so constantly don't deserve our trust. And to the extent that we give them our trust, we set ourselves up to be scammed again and again.
There are reports that there is no evidence of a direct link between Baghdad and some of these terrorist organizations.
There are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know.
Excuse me, but is this an unknown unknown?
I'm not.
Several unknowns, and I'm just wondering if this is an unknown.
I'm not going to say which it is.
But Mr. Secretary,
I'm right here. I'm right here.
In the run-up to the war in Iraq, the failure of mainstream news organizations to raise legitimate questions about the government's rush to war was compounded by the network's deliberate decision to stress military perspectives before any fighting had even begun.
we've got generals, and if you ask them about the prospects for war with Iraq, they think it is almost certain.
CNN's use of retired generals as supposedly independent experts reinforced a decidedly military mindset, even as serious questions remained about the wisdom and necessity of going to war.
Often, journalists blame the government for the failure of the journalists themselves to do independent reporting. But nobody forced the major networks like CNN to do so much commentary from retired generals and admirals and all the rest of it. You had a top CNN official named Eason Jordan going on the air of his network and boasting that he had visited the Pentagon with a list of possible military commentators. And he asked officials at the Defense Department whether that was a good list of people to hire.
Well, I think it's important to have experts explain the war and to describe the military hardware, describe the tactics, talk about the strategy behind the conflict. I went to the Pentagon myself several times before the war started, met with important people there and said, for instance, at CNN, here are the generals we're thinking of retaining to advise us on the air and off about the war, and we got a big thumbs up on all of them. That was important.
It wasn't even something to hide ultimately. It was something to say to the American people on his own network, see, we're team players. We may be the news media, but we're on the same side and the same page as the Pentagon. And that really runs directly counter to the idea of an independent press. And that suggests that we have some deep patterns of media avoidance when the U.S. is involved in a war based on lies.
My fellow Americans.
In 1964, President Lyndon Johnson falsely claimed that an attack on U.S. gunships by North Vietnamese forces in the Gulf of Tonkin gave him no choice but to escalate the war in Vietnam.
Renewed hostile actions against United States ships on the high seas in the Gulf of Tonkin have today required me to order the military forces of the United States to take action in reply.
Routinely, the official story is a lie, or a deception, or a partial bit of information that leaves out key facts.
In international waters in the Gulf of Tonkin, destroyers of the United States Navy are assigned routine patrols from time to time. Sunday, August the 2nd, 1964, the destroyer Maddox was on such a patrol. Shortly after noon, the calm of the day is broken as general quarters sound. In a deliberate and unprovoked action, 3 North Vietnam PT boats unleash a torpedo attack against the Maddox.
The official story about the Gulf of Tonkin was a lie.
The destroyer was carrying out a mission of patrol in those waters, in international waters. When it was attacked,
but it quickly became accepted as the absolute truth by the news media. And because of the press's refusal to challenge that story, it was much easier for Congress to quickly pass the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which was pivotal because it opened the floodgates to the Vietnam War.
Well, I think it's a very clear demonstration of the unity of the country behind the policies that are being followed by the President in South Vietnam, and more specifically of the action that was taken in response to the attack upon our destroyers.
At that point, the facts were secondary. In the case of the Washington Post reporting, I asked more than 3 decades later whether there had ever been a Post retraction of its reporting on the Gulf of Tonkin events. And I called the newspaper and eventually reached the man who had been the chief diplomatic correspondent for the paper at the time, Murray Martyr, and I said, Mr. Martyr, has there ever been a retraction by the Washington Post of its fallacious reporting on the Gulf of Tonkin? And he said, I can assure you it never happened. There was never any retraction. And I asked why. And he said, well, if the news media were going to retract its reporting on the Gulf of Tonkin, it would have to retract its reporting on virtually the entire Vietnam War. Fast forward a few decades, you have President George W. Bush saying that to an absolute certainty there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and that intelligence sources told him that clearly, which was not at all the case.
Secretary of State Powell will present information and intelligence about Iraq's illegal weapons programs, its attempts to hide those weapons from inspectors, and its links to terrorist groups.
The failure of American news media to check government distortion reached new heights when, on the eve of war, the highly respected Secretary of State Colin Powell appeared before the United Nations to make the case that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
Saddam Hussein's intentions have never changed. He is not developing the missiles for self-defense. These are missiles that Iraq wants in order to project power, to threaten, and to deliver chemical, biological, and, if we let him, nuclear warheads.
Today, Secretary of State Powell brought the United Nations Security Council the administration's best evidence so far.
After Colin Powell's speech to the UN, immediately the U.S. press applauded with great enthusiasm.
Did Colin Powell close the deal today in your mind for anyone who has yet objectively to make up their mind?
I think for anybody who analyzes the situation, he has closed the deal.
This irrefutable, undeniable, incontrovertible evidence today, Colin Powell brilliantly delivered that smoking gun today. Colin Powell was outstanding today. I mean, it was lockstep. It was so compelling. I don't see how anybody at this point cannot support this effort.
He made a wonderful presentation. I thought he made a great case for the purpose of disarmament.
It was devastating. I mean, and overwhelming abundance of the